Welcome, everyone. Today's special guest on the Slingshot is Cory Doctorow. Cory is a blogger, journalist, and science fiction author. He is the author of Chokepoint Capitalism, a book on how to unrig creative labor markets and get artists fairly paid. Now, Cory has perfected the art of converting essays into Twitter threads. I know I'm a big fan, which immediately go viral. Cory, welcome so much to our show. We're so happy to have you on.
Thank you. It's
the last two guests on the show, I was going to tell you, were economists. We had John Quokka and Evan Starr, and today we have a normal person. I'm just so excited about that.
That's really stretching the definition of normal, but sure.
And speaking of economists, Cory will be questioned by me plus a panel of competition scholars, including Marshall Steinbaum at the University of Utah and Darren Bush at the University of Houston. Hello, guys. Now, Darren has both a law degree and a doctorate in economics, so he's really not normal. Now, Cory, today we're going to talk about your latest Medium post on the life cycle of the online platform, which you've coined "inshitification." I hope I can say that for this audience, as well as your forthcoming book, "The Internet Con: How to Seize the Means of Computation." Now, but before diving into your writings, I think our readers who might come from a strict competition antitrust background probably like to know a little more about you. So I want to ask you, what drew you into this realm of monopolies and competition policies? You know, it's typically dominated by nerds like us, the economists and lawyers, you know. And I'm also curious if anyone in particular inspired your thoughts and your writing. I noticed there was a mention of Tim Wu on your Wikipedia page. He also inspired me. I'm just curious, you know, what brought you in?
Well, you know, it's funny. I think Tim and I maybe had the same path into this rather than Tim inspiring me. Tim and I have known each other since we were like 9 years old. We went to the same weird alternative school in suburban Toronto. And we both ended up being mentored by Larry Lessig. And through Lessig, I got involved. Well, Lessig was around as I was getting involved in questions of digital human rights. So I've worked with the Electronic Frontier Foundation for more than 2 decades now. I was their European director. Today, they call me a special advisor. I work on the competition and activism teams there, and helped really kickstart our competition program work. It's a big part of the work I do there and the work that the whole organization is involved in. And you know, I've been involved in questions of digital human rights now since the Napster wars, if not a little before. And at every turn, there has been a kind of, you know, almost unbroken monotonic trend towards bad policy. And I have spent a lot of time really like watching the sausage get made. I was a WIPO delegate. I lobbied Westminster and Brussels. I was at the FCC over the broadcast flag and so on. And I've also spent a lot of time in standards bodies, and which are kind of quasi lawmaking entities to the extent that like architecture is politics, right? Where there's a lot of politics that gets made really out of the sight of the public, and in institutions that are singularly weak and easily captured. And as I fought these fights over the years, what I learned with more and more certainty was that the problem wasn't in the character of the belligerents on one side or the other. It was in the structure of the markets that they were operating within. That the tech firms, to the extent that the tech firms were at one point champions for their users' interests, it was because they were disciplined by the fear of competition. And they, as soon as they ceased to fear competition, as soon as the web turned into what Tom Eastman calls 5 giant websites filled with screenshots of text from the other 4, that commitment just evaporated. And, you know, in Chokepoint Capitalism, we spent a lot of time talking about the give and take between the large entertainment firms and the large tech firms and how they treat creative labor forces. And, you know, when Napster came along, the entertainment industry's biggest handicap in fighting Napster was its claim to be champions for musicians. You know, an industry that paid the Beatles 1 cent for every LP to split 4 ways, less a 15% clawback for marketing expenses, cannot credibly claim to be agitating on behalf of creative workers. And there was a period, and you know, we track it in the book, there was a period in which the incomes of creative workers rose because the tech sector was a bulwark against the abuses of the entertainment sector. But as the tech sector grew increasingly concentrated, they became indistinguishable from the entertainment sector and how they dealt with creative labor markets. And today, I think the best example would be Spotify, which was forced because of market conditions to take on the big three labels, Sony, Warner, and Universal, which collectively hold the copyright to 70% of all the recorded music, not because they invested in it, but because they were able to acquire the firms that had invested in it. And YouTube, which is a music service or has a music subcomponent, both of which are incredibly bad for the creative workers who supply the music. And the fact that one is owned by Google and the other one is owned by Sony, Warner, and Universal has no bearing on the labor conditions. The labor conditions are the result of the extent to which they fear someone will offer a better deal to the workers in their labor pool. And when they no longer have to fear that, they do not act in a way that is distinct from one another. And so I got more and more involved in this, and you know, out of Occupy and questions about inequality and other kind of political foments over the last decade, found myself more and more interested in the economic critique, and indeed, if you'll forgive me, the critique of economists as a way of thinking about how we did arrive at this juncture.
Excellent. Well, let's talk about the forthcoming nonfiction book. You've got so many, I have to use nonfiction there, which is The Internet Con, which explains the need for interoperability to curb big tech's power over users. I want you to imagine if Darren and Marshall were big, bad book publishers and they were intent on merging down to becoming a monopsonist, how would you pitch it to them? Just, you know, what is your kind of 2-minute elevator pitch over how to get these guys excited about the book?
Well, look, sorry, am I pitching the thesis of the book to them as something that they should agitate for in their relations with policymakers, or am I pitching the book to them as a thing that they might publish?
That they would publish, the latter.
Oh, I see. Thank you. Yeah. So, you know, we have put all of our emphasis in the way that we talk about tech platforms and making the platforms better, right? We really think about the problem of Facebook's, you know, for example, as that we have the wrong person acting as the unelected social media czar for life of 3 billion people's lives. And really, I think the problem is that we need to abolish that job. And when people express dissatisfaction with Facebook but don't leave Facebook, something must be going on. And, you know, the explanation that we get from the kind of popular press these days is that Facebook perfected a mind control ray. They did what, you know, MK Ultra and the pickup artists and Rasputin couldn't do, and they figured out how to hack our dopamine loops so we can't stop using Facebook. And when you actually consider the material conditions and the lived experience of people who are stuck on Facebook, what they tell you is everybody I love and the things that matter to me are on Facebook, and I can't get them all to agree on where to go next. And we didn't get Facebook by having everyone agree that they should leave MySpace and go to Facebook. We got Facebook by letting people kind of ooze over. Facebook had to contend with the problem in 2006 when they went open to the public that everyone who wanted to use social media already had a MySpace account. And so rather than saying, hey, let's organize next Wednesday as International Quit MySpace Day, what they did was they gave people a bot. You gave that bot your login, your password for MySpace. It would go and fetch your waiting messages. It would put them in your Facebook inbox in your feed. You could reply to them and it would autopilot it out. You could leave, right? You could leave without having to leave the things that mattered to you. You didn't have to choose between being spied on by MySpace and going to Facebook, which, as Dina Srinivasana reminds us, Facebook was the privacy-forward, surveillance-free alternative to MySpace in 2006. You could have no surveillance, and you could have all of your friends in a service that treated you better, and you didn't have to make that choice. That was because of interoperability. And in the years since, the same companies that benefited from interoperability, Apple, Microsoft, Google, Facebook, they've all kicked the ladder away. They've created a kind of penumbra of laws and policies that make employing the same tactics that they employed into something radioactively illegal. If you were to do to Apple what Apple did to Microsoft in 2002, when they cloned Microsoft Office and made Pages, Numbers, and Keynote, the iWork suite, they would bomb you until the rubble bounced. right? They would say that you're a tortious interferer with their contracts. You violated the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. You violated Section 1201 of the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. You're a copyright infringer. You're a patent infringer. You know, you're doing things that are bad for privacy, and you would not be able to make that competitive offer that would let people take parts of the service they like and leave behind the parts that they didn't. And so interoperability is the thing they fear the most. It's the thing that lowers the switching costs, solves the collective action problems, and allows for meaningful alternatives to emerge, for someone to enter the market and do something new without having to convince you that you have to give up on everything you already have before you can try it. And that interoperability is something that we can attain through a mix of policies. Making those policies work is hard. It requires that you have an understanding of economics, law, and technology. And The Internet Con is a book that synthesizes a legal critique, a technological critique, and an economic critique of big tech, and proposes systemic shovel-ready policy ideas for addressing them.
Nice. Darren and Marshall, upon hearing that pitch, are you guys ready to publish it with your monopoly publishing firm?
Yes, but I'm not sure I'm ready to actually put in place what Cory's talking about. So the immediate reaction that I have to the suggestion of interoperability as a remedy for tech platform power is basically that it sounds good, but I worry that a suite of remedies that is like operating behind the scenes, that fundamentally the incumbents have control over how they're implemented. When they say they did it and then 6 months later nothing's changed, we would think, oh, that's because they screwed it up somehow, that the interoperability doesn't work, but they're going to say, oh no, that's because we're the best. We gave them the opportunity to leave, they didn't leave. QED, we're the incumbent monopolist because we deserve to be. So
yeah,
how do you
fully half the book is about solving that problem. So I'm with you.
Well, I understand you want us to buy the book, but you're going to give us a little taste beforehand.
Sure. I mean, if you'd like me to explain that bit, I can. I want to hear from
To
Darren
the
as well.
degree that you can in a few minutes, absolutely, yes.
Yeah, sure. So interoperability, to attain a stable interoperability equilibrium, you need to have both mandates and self-help measures, because mandates are slow, right? People say, okay, you gotta create this API, and then you gotta follow the API, and then we want you to shut the API down if like someone is stealing user data, but not to use that as a pretext to just eliminate new market entrants and make life hell for them and their users. Resolving the question of whether like a shutdown was real or pretextual is this fact-intensive question that you could spend 10 years trying to figure out, because like to a first approximation, everybody who knows how Facebook's backend works is a Facebook employee. So who are you going to ask to figure out whether it was pretextual? So what you need to do is balance that out with a self-help measure, what I've called adversarial interoperability or competitive compatibility, ComCom, which is a suite of policies that immunize people for reverse engineering, bots, and scraping, provided that they color within the lines of consumer protection laws, privacy, fraud, and so on. And so if I am lawfully permitted to do things that today no one would fund me to do, like scrape, reverse engineer, and crawl, in order to achieve the interoperability through other means that I would get through the API, then a firm that is contemplating undermining the interoperability goals of the API mandate has to contemplate the possibility that they're going to get involved in a land war in Asia, right? That there's going to be guerrilla warfare where people who have the attacker's advantage, who don't need to be perfect, but need to find only one imperfection in your defenses, are going to be consuming an unquantifiable number of your engineering hours in order to do things that, if you take countermeasures to them, will only make your own users unhappy, right? Trying to distinguish a bot from a Facebook user requires that you identify someone who is definitely a human. If you have 3 billion users, that means that you have 3,001 in a million use cases every day. Figuring out who's a human and who's a bot in that environment is very hard. And so the firms, they don't like surprising their shareholders with bad news, right? We've seen what happened to Facebook in the last year a couple of times in a row. It gives bad news, we're with fewer users last quarter than we thought we would have. $250 billion cut off the share price. And the people who have the most Facebook shares in their portfolio are the executives who take the decisions to break the interoperability. So nobody ever lost money betting against the hubris of tech executives. Even with these incentives in place, the tech executives might go ahead and break the interop. And if they do, the self-help remedy bridges the gap. And so we have both set of incentives that incentivize people to do the right thing, and a fallback position in the event that it doesn't work.
Okay, so my follow-up on that is this. So when we talk about these kind of interoperability issues in the online space, these are issues that we've had in physical markets like electricity, natural gas, and things of that sort. So how do you tell when Microsoft was famously in the case charged with corrupting Java, making Java virtual machine, which was not interoperable. So how do you reconcile the notion that Microsoft is actually engaged in a bad behavior that is designed to kill interoperability versus somebody else's incentive, perhaps, to kill Microsoft by saying that they are deliberately engaging in interoperability problems when they're not?
Yeah, so I think that this is sort of the same answer as the last question, which is that resolving the question of like when someone is engaged in bona fide anti-competitive behavior, it's fact intensive, it's time consuming. There's a lot of political economy, right? The people who brief for the tech sector aren't wrong when they say one of the reasons that we're so angry at the tech sector right now is in part because of a well-funded campaign from the telecom sector. I think that's entirely true. It's not why I'm angry at tech, but I think it's where some of that energy comes from. And so figuring out who we should hit with the interoperability mandate hammer is going to be like a long run process. But adversarial interoperability kind of makes that question less salient. Because if it turns out that there is conduct that doesn't rise to the level of enforcement, but still, in retrospect, 20 years from now, we'll look back on that and say, if only someone had been able to interoperate with that, think of what amazing thing we could have had, or more importantly, because we were able to interoperate with that, look at this amazing thing we got. Then all we need to do is immunize people for doing the things that the tech sector has always done until the last 15 years, and cabin that off or put guardrails on it that are built around consumer protection and not shareholder protection, right? Privacy and anti-fraud and things like that, not tortious interference.
Can I go with one of mine? I just sticking on this theme of switching costs, which I think is related to interoperability. You make a big deal of switching costs as being the root of the market failures in big tech.
Well, social media, yes. Not e-commerce.
Yeah. And I'm reminded how I and some of my friends were trying to switch to Mastodon. You may have heard of it. When Elon decided to make Twitter inhospitable to liberals. And I just learned today, I didn't know this, that you guys probably knew, that he's now labeled NPR as a, quote, U.S. state-affiliated media. But anyway, we were thwarted by many things, but one of the things I was using that cross-posting at the suggestion of a liberal economist, and then all of a sudden he cut it out, right? At which point, I would have to completely make the leap. I felt like that was kind of proof just how difficult it is, even if we're all together and we say, hey, let's make the switch. Why are we supporting Elon on this platform? It's just hard to do that. We've all built up. I'm the smallest of probably all three, but we've all built up a following on Twitter, and it's going to be very hard to move over to Mastodon. I don't know if you had any thoughts on that Twitter thing. How are we ever going to topple Twitter? And your book gave this great example of Apple, which I don't know if our readers or listeners fully know. You mentioned it briefly at the top, but the notion of how they overcame switching costs to be able to kind of break into Microsoft's Office suite. Take it however you want, Twitter, sure. Apple, or your favorite switching cost problem.
I can tell you a little about the Apple story. So okay. I was a kind of CIO for hire back then. I was helping little SMEs, build LANs and sometimes get a DSL line in or a ISDN and connect to the internet, that kind of thing. And a lot of my clients, they would be Windows shops and they'd have one or two Macs. There'd be like the CEO's PowerBook and like the designer. And they had this problem, right? Which was that Microsoft Office was the way that everybody did collaboration. And Microsoft Office for the Mac was the most cursed piece of software that Microsoft ever released. You just had to like wave the install floppy near a file, a Windows file, like a Word file, and it would be permanently corrupted and irrecoverably corrupted. And so eventually we put a PC on the desk next to the designer's Mac. And then it was like, oh, this is unwieldy. So then we got a big graphics card and we put it in the PC and threw away the Mac and got them Quark and Adobe for Windows, right? And Steve Jobs saw the writing on the wall. So he didn't beg Bill Gates to make better Office. He just got some of his technologists to reverse engineer the Microsoft Office file formats and released iWork Suite, which is Pages, Numbers, Keynote, which is compatible with Word, Excel, and PowerPoint. And what's really interesting about that, well, one thing is they ran a campaign after that called the Switch campaign that was just a bunch of people on a white background. You know what the old Apple ads looked like, saying it's just really easy to switch. Like, it's really easy to switch. You just switch. You buy a Mac, you throw away your PC, all the files come with you, you lose nothing, right? The other interesting thing is in the wake of that campaign, Microsoft stopped breaking compatibility. So they had been revising and revising and revising Office in this way that in retrospect is very clearly calculated to prevent people from building interoperable products. But that created an engineering cost for Microsoft because the internal inconsistencies between Word 3.1 and Word 3.11 required that some engineer at Microsoft resolve those inconsistencies for Word 4. And this just became this enormous boat anchor around Microsoft's neck. And as soon as they lost the competitive advantage, they went to a standards body and they standardized those Office file formats. That's what the X at the end of XLSX and DocX and PPTX mean. It's XML. And that's why we have Google Docs and LibreOffice. And it's why if you copy some text out of Word and paste it into the right kind of web form, all of its formatting goes with it. Right? Because that's just the XML moving over from one to the other. And that's that standardization that grew out of suing for peace in this war. In terms of Mastodon, Twitter really has to do extra engineering to stop Mastodon from working. I mean, for one thing, Mastodon is built on a standard called ActivityPub. ActivityPub was the basis for Twitter's API. When Blaine Cook was creating Twitter's API, he based it on ActivityPub. So they have to do more engineering to take the interoperability out, right? If we were to tell them that they had to support ActivityPub, that remedy is pretty administratable, right? Like we can figure out whether they're supporting ActivityPub because ActivityPub has some standard test suites. It's an open standard. There is a well-defined crisp meaning that says I am compatible with ActivityPub. And so we could very easily figure that out. It's also a remedy that doesn't create a capital moat. Implementing an open standard is by definition one of the cheapest, most ready ways of complying with some kind of conduct remedy, right? So it's not like we're asking them to invent something new. Like, you know, you see with these anti-cryptography bills that are worried about people doing bad things with encrypted messengers. And, you know, demand number one from governments is invent a kind of cryptography that keeps bad guys out, but not cops, right? Which is like invent some water that's not wet, right? We're not saying that, right? We're saying like implement this well understood technology that already has a ton of reference implementations. So it has a very low capital moat. It has a very low administrative burden. And in terms of the Mastodon servers, which is the other thing that you need to worry about here, you know, there's a guy who ran a service called mastodon.lol. He was just a volunteer. He had 12,000 users, and his users got into this stupid flame war about the Harry Potter video game. And it got so odious that he was like, this is not what I signed up for. I'm shutting down the server. You guys all need to find somewhere else to have this argument. Now, that may sound really terrible to you, right? Like, we're just going to turn all these people who today rely on Twitter and send them out into the world to find random people running servers out of the garage and hope that they don't shut them down. But here's the thing. ActivityPub has built into it a portability structure. So all you need to do is with one click, export everyone who follows you and everyone you follow. And with another click, import it into another server. And everyone who follows you and everyone you follow automatically just jumps over to the new server. 2 clicks, right? So we could say to this hobbyist, you have a very lightweight compliance duty that would be something that is already coherent with like the CCPA or the GDPR privacy laws that include a right to access your own data. You have a duty to your users, whether or not they're paying, to give them their own data, including this data that they need to leave your server and go somewhere else. So you can shut it down, but maybe you have to retain that data for 6 months and supply it on demand. And again, what does the administration for this look like? Say you kick me off of mastodon.how. right? And I say, I never got my data, and I go to the AG or whatever, and they go to you and they say, Hal, you never gave Cory his data. We don't need an investigation to figure out whether you gave me you gave me my data. You just give me another copy and we're done, right? No giant administrative overhead, no capital moat that prevents new market entrants, right? The 450 million people who are using Twitter when Musk took it over are in a much worse position than those 12,000 users on Mastodon, on that Mastodon server that shut down. So again, interoperability is a way to give people like a very easy way to leave Twitter without having to leave behind that audience. Because if you could go to Mastodon, if you could go to a Mastodon server, whatever you're on, mastodon.hal, and continue to reach everyone who's following you on Twitter, you could just do that tomorrow. All this stuff about like, do I post on Mastodon? Do I post on Twitter? It would just be like, what permissions do I set on the post that I have? Do I click the syndicate button or do I not click the syndicate button? And if you want to reach the people on Twitter, that's what you do, right? That is, I think, a way to, rather than perfecting Musk, we can treat him as damage and routing around him.
I got it. Now, I think with this next topic, I might be able to bring at least Marshall and maybe Marshall and Darren. We're going to go to this concept of the role of antitrust and the inability or maybe unwillingness to enforce antitrust as the cause of why we're in this monopolized state right now. This is a thesis that you develop quite nicely in the book. And you are probably well aware that certain folks of our stripe, industrial economists, industrial organization economists, who incidentally, not all, but many fetishize powerful firms, have peddled an alternative hypothesis to yours that they lovingly refer to as the superstar firm, in which globalization or technological change have pushed sales towards just naturally to the most productive firms in each industry, which causes product market concentration to rise as industries become increasingly dominated by firms with high markups and low labor share of value added. Now, I know Marshall is a very big fan of this theory, right, Marshall? But now, Cory or Marshall, this is for both of you. I mean, how do we have two kind of hypotheses, dueling hypotheses, right? They're trying to explain the world. And so how do we, rule out the Chicago school theory that it's the superstar firm and kind of rule in Cory's theory that it's basically the Chicago school's defanging of antitrust that allowed these firms to come to monopolize? How do we go about kind of breaking that logjam?
I mean, Marshall, it's your show. I'll let you go first. I've got my own ideas here.
Well, okay, Hal, you've required me to do the typical academic thing of citing myself. I have a paper that takes apart the superstar firm hypothesis called Estimating Market and Monopoly Power in Tech Platform Antitrust Cases, some title like that, basically, oh, I'm sorry, that's actually not the right title. It's anyway, it doesn't matter what the title of the paper is. So how do we take apart the Chicago School hypothesis? Basically show that it's empirically incorrect. So it runs through a number of the reasons why that model fails to predict economic reality. You mentioned the idea that what distinguishes a superstar firm is that they have a high degree of technological capability and a low labor share of value added. The models that actually include that will predict flagrantly counterfactual things about the labor market. So for example, as superstar firms take over, what you should see is workers fleeing from the non-superstar firms and going to work at the superstar firms, if that model is correct. And in fact, the rates at which people reallocate in the labor market have been in decline for decades, up until the pandemic, I should say. So the evidence that I'm citing is basically from the 2000s and 2010s, so flagrantly at odds with the idea that there's lots of labor market churn. And so the superstar firm hypothesis actually contradicts itself in the way that the idea is the superstar firm has this low labor share of value added, and then there's a whole other strand of literature called super firm. So it sounds like superstar firms, but it's actually the super firm literature. That is about the fact that workers get paid more who work for more productive firms. But the superstar firm literature says everyone gets paid the same regardless of which firm you work for. So the superstar firm literature basically says there should be no differences in what workers get paid between superstar firms and non-superstar firms. What's the difference is the size of the firm, basically. So the superstar firm are bigger, they have more workers, but all those workers make the same as the small number of workers who work for the non-superstar firm. Also counterfactual, the super firm literature shows that's not true. workers who work at the so-called super firms get paid more than workers who don't work at the super firm. So that's only on the labor side. There's a couple of other things now that are skipping my mind about the labor implications being wrong. On the sort of consumer side, if you want to say, the more traditional industrial organization type tests, in order for the superstar firm literature to be right, you have to have a lot of consumers switching from, so you've got a superstar firm and a non-superstar firm. The superstar firm produces more efficiently. They have to, the reason why consumers would switch from the non-superstar firm to the superstar firm is that they're able to lower price and still charge a higher markup. So superstar firm lowers price by a little bit. So their cost of production goes way down. They're a superstar firm. They pass a little bit of that declining cost of production through to consumer prices. So they charge a little bit less than the non-superstar firm. That has to cause lots of consumers to switch over, namely a very high consumer demand elasticity in order to sustain this model. And in fact, we see very low consumer demand elasticities, and we don't see lower prices from the superstar firms. So, I mean, I'm belaboring this point because it's kind of mystifying why, I mean, I guess it isn't mystifying. It's an ideologically convenient view to have about why these tech platform firms are so powerful, but it's just flagrantly at odds with all of the other evidence that we have about how labor markets work in general, about why, or about the consumer behavior facing the tech platforms. It just, there's like no sense in which it makes empirical sense, like if you dig down even like 1 inch below the surface of what the hypothesis is.
Cory, do you want to weigh in? What's wrong with these?
Yeah, I found that very well said. I obviously take a different approach. I'm not a trained economist, and particularly I'm not a quant. Having been raised by a mathematician, I know exactly how much I'm not a quant. So I take a different, perhaps you could call it ethnographic approach. So one of the things that I know about these firms from direct experience, from advising companies that were acquired by the firms and so on, is that their growth strategy is driven by acquisition, and that they are extremely bad at integrating the firms that they acquire. So, exhibit number 1 is Yahoo, where basically, fueled by Saudi oil money laundered through SoftBank, Yahoo bought every promising Web 2.0 startup and just destroyed them. 2-1, I think, and just wiped billions of dollars of value out. And you have a company like Flickr, which I was very involved with, that was the first company to ever do like mobile photographs, and which became a political football among dueling princelings within the corporate structure, who saw as their primary victory condition wrong-footing adversaries who were their colleagues, and making sure that things in their adversaries' portfolios failed, more so than making sure that their own portfolio companies or acquisitions succeeded. And then you look at a firm like Google, whose graveyard of products is very large, and you see that this is a firm that made one successful product. They made a search engine. They cloned another successful product, Hotmail. They acquired some products from their competitors, like taking a discarded version of WebKit and building Chrome out of it. Every other product they have built in-house has been a failure, right? Whether that's Reader or Google Video or G+, and every successful product they have, irrespective of whether it is mobile or ads or server management or customer management or docs or collaboration, those are acquisitions. And so what you have is a firm that styles itself as the kind of Willy Wonka factory of innovative ideas, and which is actually just a firm with seemingly unlimited access to the capital markets. And the users of Google increasingly express dissatisfaction. It started on the side of their business customers. So their business customers for many years have been complaining about search quality, about the price of ads, about the amount of money they get from ads. We are getting some detail in that picture now, thanks to the Texas AG case against Google and Facebook, where we see things coming to light like Jedi Blue, where we see Facebook and Google colluding to rig the ad market and take 50 cents out of every dollar in ads and starve media companies. If they are efficient, then they have the kind of efficiency that Ida Tarbell in History of the Standard Oil Company calls the illegitimate greatness, where she says, Rockefeller is very good at making a good oil refinery, but he's also very good at hiring goons with railroad ties to beat the shit out of people building pipelines that rival his. And that is not a greatness that we should wish to see. You know, being a superstar mafioso is not the kind of superstar we want to nurture. And so, you know, the fact that they're really good at rigging labor markets, as they did in their collusive agreement to not poach each other's engineers, or rigging ad markets, as they did in their collusive arrangement to steal money from publishers, that is not the kind of superstardom I think that we want. You know, today you see the kind of end stage of the enshittification cycle when a firm has extracted all the surplus from its users, all the surplus from its business customers, and has tried to surf this wave that is right at the crest of not leaving just enough surplus there that the business customers and end users remain locked in, but extracting everything else for their shareholders, where that brittle equilibrium shatters because of a scandal or because of something else, because of some exogenous shock, and then they're just left floundering. So you have Facebook, who decided that the future is that we're all going to be legless, sexless, low polygon cartoon characters in a highly surveilled virtual world named after an idea from a 25-year-old dystopian science fiction novel. And you've got Google, who are like, the answer to the increasing decline in search quality is that instead of giving you links to web pages, we'll give you long florid passages written by a confident liar chatbot. And, you know, these are the fact that these firms are still in business when they're so just manifestly stupid. You could either have a kind of circular reasoning that says they must not be stupid because they're still in business, or you could kind of bow to common sense and say these stupid things being in business is evidence that the system is broken.
So I want to jump in and make 2 points. The first one is the obvious one, that you are saying superstar wrong. It should be superstar, right? There's that, and then but the bigger point is
economists more fun than those other losers.
Yeah.
Talking to Cory.
The fun side is the lawyer side, you know, not the economist.
Okay.
The other major point is you make this point about acquisition, and there's a lot of this innovation that happens through acquisition. A lot of that innovation through acquisition has happened because they fear competition, and so they acquire what, you know, are potential competitors and to stop and halt perhaps other innovation. And so you mentioned you know that you know, you want to break them up. Is how? and I'll combine that with another question, is like how, and what's your prime candidate for that one?
Yeah. So here's the thing. I think that there's a joke from Ireland whose punchline is if you wanted to get there, I wouldn't start from here. Right? That the great sin of the Chicago school was to fail to acknowledge that the reason to prevent monopoly formation, even if you stipulate to the existence of beneficial monopolies, is that if they ever sour, right? If they ever curdle, the monopolies are extraordinarily good at defending themselves against regulatory intervention. You know, see AT&T outspend, or IBM outspending the DOJ antitrust division every year for 12 consecutive years from 1970 to 1982, right? So, you know, the referee has to be more powerful than the teams on the field. And one of the reasons to prevent monopoly formation is to make them governable. And, you know, if you're like small government libertarian out there and you want small government and all you want is a government that enforces contracts, you still need a government that's bigger than the firms whose contracts they're enforcing, right? Otherwise, how are they going to enforce the contracts, right? So, you know, the smaller the firms, the smaller the government that keeps them honest. So one way or another, whether you're a socialist or you know, you can't read your copy of the Fountainhead anymore because the pages are all stuck together, you know, you should want a small government or small firms so that you can have the small government. I think that what has driven the curdling of tech is not merely a failure to enforce antitrust, but some epiphenomena of that. Namely, that tech firms, due to their concentration, are able to secure favorable regulation and favorable interpretations of existing regulation that prohibit users from modifying technology, or more importantly, new market entrants from modifying technology on behalf of users. So ad blocking on the web is possible because the web is an open platform. Ad blocking on a phone on an iPhone requires reverse engineering the DRM on the iPhone, which under Section 1201 of the Digital Millennium Copyright Act is a felony punishable by a 5-year prison sentence and a $500,000 fine. So anything that might discipline the firm on behalf of the users is off limits because of law. And then you combine that with a unique technical element, which is that the digital platforms are malleable in a way that physical platforms aren't. You know, JP Morgan or Rockefeller, I don't think that they were like smarter or more venal or dumber than Zuckerberg or Pichai or whatever. But I do think that they were constrained by the hard capital requirements of anti-competitive ventures. If there's a ferry line you want to put at a business by laying down a railroad track at a loss, you can't just lay down the railroad track by clicking a mouse, right? If you're Jeff Bezos, grocer, owner of Whole Foods, and you want to twiddle the price of eggs, you need an army of teenagers on roller skates with pricing guns. If you're Jeff Bezos, owner of Amazon Fresh, and you want to twiddle the price of eggs, you move a slider. And so, you know, in any shell game, the quickness of the hand deceives the eye. The faster you can move, the more you can keep your adversaries, be they business customers, new market entrants, or end users, off balance, right, on the back foot. It's hard for users to know when they're getting a good deal when the deal changes from moment to moment to moment to moment to moment. Everything is a spot market. Everything is changing from second to second. You have to be a high-speed trader writing, you know, trading algorithms to buy your eggs every week at the grocery store. And so you have these three things in a stack. You have the failure to enforce antitrust law, which is cross-sectoral, and it's everywhere we look. You have the malleability of technology, which allows highly concentrated firms to do things to users who can't leave because they've extinguished all their rivals thanks to the failure to enforce antitrust law. And then you've got the prohibitions on user self-help measures or new market entrants giving self-help measures to users that are secured by dint of the lack of competition, because every regulatory procedure becomes just a kind of auction where you ask the three telcos, is net neutrality good? And they all say no, right? And there isn't 100 telcos, 50 of whom are like, here's our usage statistics and network logs. There are no network management problems created by this. These are fully surmountable problems, and there's no reason not to have this policy. Those facts just aren't in evidence, or to the extent that they are, it's like academics and people running community services or whatever. It's not big industrial actors that regulators pay attention to. So you have bad policy, you have technical malleability, and you've got a lack of market concentration that delivers those other two. To unwind them, we need to do three things. The first is we need to do traditional antitrust, which, thanks to Lena Khan, take a drink, thanks to Jonathan Cantor, take a drink, we are doing those things, right? Marguerite Vestager, Terry Breton, the Chinese cyberspace directive prohibits companies from taking anti-interoperability measures, right? Like this is everywhere. Competition and Markets Authority, Digital Markets Unit, even Canada is going to revise its competition law, which is so unfit for purpose that it would be a joke if it wasn't so unfunny. And so, you know, this is everywhere, right? We're doing the antitrust stuff. We need to curtail the twiddling. So we need to create prohibitions on certain kinds of platform activity, like certain kinds of deceptive pricing arrangements or privacy invasions, right? Like if you want to make sure that media companies can command more of their advertising dollars, one way to do that is to ban surveillance so that advertising becomes entirely grounded on the context of the ad rather than the behavior of the user. The media companies know more about the context of the ad. The intermediaries know more about the behavior of the user. If you want to shift power balance, prohibit anything that would be derived from non-consensual surveillance data, and you will shift money back to the media companies.
Just to be clear here, you're suggesting that there should be no algorithmic pricing at all?
No, I said certain kinds, so I hedged.
Oh, okay.
But what I am
Just
saying
checking.
is that what I am
Is
saying,
that-
so in some ways there's the way that you answer the question of which kind is in the third part, which is immunizing end users and their proxies in the form of new market entrants for reverse engineering bots and scraping and whatever. Think about all of those services that were scraping all the airline prices and trying to predict how they were doing pricing, right? If if they have to play cat and mouse with those firms, right? When you think about like how the airlines responded to that, or how Google responds to scraping, or Facebook responds to scraping, you know, you're an executive at one of these firms and you step out of your office, and on the left is a building full of lawyers, and on your right is a building full of engineers. And you could go to the building full of engineers and you could say, block the scrapers, but they never do. They go into the building full of lawyers and they say, sue them, because they know that there's an attacker's advantage, and they know that a legal determination that it's unlawful will chill new market entrants by preventing any kind of capitalization of these activities. So you have to immunize users, because then what you end up with is a minority of cases that are so egregious that they're pretty easy to see. You know, we rigged an algorithm just not to show favorable loans to Black people, is a thing that, you know, becomes much, we have much more enforcement capability to devote to that. It's fact intensive, it's hard to prove. And a lot of the other stuff just gets taken care of by having countermeasures where users can see how they're being manipulated. So prevent twiddling by firms, enable twiddling by users, and do traditional antitrust. And as to where we should start, I think the ad tech bill is pretty good, the new one, Mike Lee's one. I also think that there's a low-hanging fruit, which is that any conduct promise that was used to secure a merger that was subsequently violated, we should unwind that merger. And if it's expensive and difficult for the firm, we should really unwind that merger. We should destroy the firms, and we should create examples out of them. You have to execute an admiral to encourage the others. So we should go to Facebook and we should say, you promised you'd never integrate the back ends of WhatsApp and Instagram. You told the European Commission that. Guess what? Every penny you have from now on is going to be spent unwinding those mergers. And if there's no Facebook, Instagram, or WhatsApp at the end of it, great, because no one else is going to pull this bullshit again if we do that to you.
Well, I'm not going to support Mike Lee's bill until he supports my bill. Is that immature? Anyway,
Hal, it's like you're in the Senate already.
not yet. I want to go to this one. Your book notes that you do a great job taking apart the consumer welfare standard. So bravo on that. I know that's one of Darren's callings as well. And you note that worker welfare has been largely ignored under the consumer welfare standard. I mean, it wasn't until this book merger, right, that was stopped that we really put workers on the same playing field as consumers, right, in the antitrust hierarchy, which was kind of exciting. And you quote, I just want to read this one. You say, quote, Google, Facebook, and Apple aren't democratically accountable public institutions. They are privately held, shareholder value maximizing firms. I mean, you're exactly right. That's what they care about. That's what they should care about. And but to that end, I want to come up with a justification, or at least an excuse, maybe a rationale for why maybe they're behaving. Maybe it's not them. I just want to suggest maybe the market is forcing them to do bad things. The Economist, of all places, which I try to pick on every Saturday, they wrote last week that the stock market appears to have rewarded big tech for its massive layoffs since December, a 17% lift in market cap in response to 114,000 job cuts. Bravo, guys, bravo. Noting that companies like Salesforce are, quote, hearing the market's message, end quote, and started mass firing themselves, right? So I just want to ask you guys, you know, you've been so critical of big tech, but is it possible that it's the market that is to blame for driving big tech, you know, in this direction? I just want to put that out there. You know, should we rely on market forces to dictate things like labor policy in this country? I don't know, Marshall, Cory, anyway, Darren, weigh in on this one.
Well, look, I don't think there is the market, right? I think the market always operates within parameters created by the polity. One of the downstream effects of gutting labor, which is a direct effect of consumer welfarism, is that the countervailing force that would have acted as a brake on those layoffs, right? That would have allowed those firms led by ordinary mediocrities, no better than or worse than you or me, and just as capable of being spooked or stampeded into bad action and rationalizing things that are harmful. Those firms are behaving the way they are in part because nobody is going to stop them. And the reason nobody is going to stop them is because there isn't an organized labor force that acts as a check on legislation that permits this conduct.
Yeah, I mean,
Darren, you want to weigh in?
Opportunity to say that, you know, I think so. I think everyone on this call or on this recording agrees that the consumer welfare standard has acted to the detriment of workers. I feel like the next kind of big beast to slay, so to speak, at least on the ideological level, is like that horizontal coordination overall is desirable in an economy as opposed to vertical control. So when you say, if there's no countervailing force on the part of workers to push back against being victimized by this sort of fad of layoffs to appease the stock market, yeah, that's definitely true. The more controversial position is this idea that there should be horizontal coordination on the part of counterparties to the tech sector across the board, whether we're talking about actual workers, that is to say employees who are legally employed by the company, or all of their much vaster armies of counterparties, especially upstream. And those of us who favor deconcentration of power in the economy have to kind of get moving and sharper in our articulation of the argument that horizontal coordination, that on its face as existing legal analyses would determine, flagrantly violate the antitrust laws, actually are agents of the power deconcentration that we seek. And basically the end state, at least speaking for myself, that we're looking for in a sort of antitrust legal regime is like vertical control. That's the supreme evil of antitrust. That's the thing that's per se illegal. Horizontal coordination, that's where you get a sort of rule of reason type thing where if it's all the bad guys in a smoke-filled room, that's illegal. But if it's the small players countering a monopsonistic buyer, dominant
Sure.
platform, then horizontal coordination is the way to go, and in fact to be encouraged by the antitrust laws.
Marshall's peddling the newspaper bill. Darren, you're about to weigh in.
Yeah, well, this is an age-old question, and I called it in a paper a long time ago the Section 2 trap, which is that lax merger enforcement begets a behemoth, and the retaliation against the behemoth from the little folks becomes a per se Section 1 violation, and so the bully wins. So as I tell my antitrust class, it's actually the Goliath that wins, and the reason is that not proportional antitrust enforcement. And I think that stems from the consumer welfare standard. When you focus only on cost reductions and you're only focusing on one aspect of the market, which in my paper with Glick, why economists should support populist antitrust goals, we talk about that the consumer welfare standard was a misread discussion of Marshall and others, and without any of the caveats that they put into the argument. And no one has ever asserted, at least the founding fathers of consumer welfare, that this should be the end all of all antitrust enforcement or happiness. So yeah, I'm all for taking down consumer welfare standard. I wasn't once before, a long time ago I wasn't, but now I'm on board. I'm not on board so much with fighting evil with evil. Well, I have a soft spot for unions, but that has a labor exemption. So, but when you start letting counterparties engage in things that they claim are for the good of the people, well, that's just every Section 1 conspiracy I've ever heard of was named to be good for the good of the people, right? So.
Well, I'll conclude this by bringing up the Seventh Circuit hearing on the McDonald's no poach case. So Hal, you can close your ears here.
I can hear. I just can't say anything. Go ahead.
Corey's
like, what's going on here, Corey?
Excellent.
I'm the workers' economist in that case. So I'm just listening.
So we can find you.
And I did not put Marshall up to this, but go ahead. Say next thing.
I only read the write-up in the news. I don't know exactly what was said at the hearing, but I was heartened because the panel consists of both Diane Wood and Frank Easterbrook. And it seemed like, Wood put up this idea against the defendants, like, aren't you saying that basically monopsony should be legal because it reduces costs? And that satisfies the consumer welfare standard. And it seemed to me from the write-up that Easterbrook was completely behind that formulation from Wood, where I would have thought that he'd be the king of monopsony is legal because it reduces costs. I mean, he says pretty much that in his 1984 paper on vertical restraints in the Sherman Act. And so the idea that the balance of ideological forces has shifted such that the idea that the antitrust laws encourage monopsony because it reduces costs is absurd, and Easterbrook is agreeing with that. If my reading of that write-up is correct, that bespeaks a pretty strong shift.
So can I say about horizontal coordination that at least in some instances, it seems pretty clear to me that horizontal coordination is one of a suite of potential remedies and not the best one. So take the newspaper bill, right? We have newspaper bargaining code in France. We have something similar to it in Australia. It has not been a success, right? It's made the newspapers beholden to the tech firms. I think it has materially undermined the quality of their coverage of those tech firms. I know in Canada, when the Toronto Star, which is the largest paper, was writing critically about Google, as soon as Google agreed to pay a link tax, that critical coverage series just disappeared mid-series. So I think it compromises their ability to do this. What we also saw in Australia was that when you gave a bargaining power, a bargaining right for the right to link to newspapers to the press, that the Murdoch press was able to bargain harder than the small press, and that the Murdoch press took the lion's share of the money. And far from investing in journalism, they declared a dividend and laid off their reporters. Meanwhile, if you actually attend to the structure of the market and what costs the media companies money, it's not the fact that anyone can talk about the news, right? If you're not allowed to talk about the news, it's not the news, it's a secret, right? The thing that actually changes the material outcomes, the distributional outcomes of news consumption are things like the App Store tax, right? Do you want to increase the share, the income that every newspaper subscriber generates by 30% tomorrow? Just create alternative app stores for the two major platforms and mandate that they be as easy to access as the default ones. Create competition so that the price of transactions falls to 2% instead of 30%, and you'll get 28% increase in the revenue from every subscriber to every newspaper, whether they're a small paper or a large paper. Likewise, if you want to double the amount of money newspapers are getting from their ads, break up the ad tech monopolies, right, as we see in the Lee bill. And we'll go from 50% to 10%, which is what it should be, right? If you want to put newspapers in control of their ads, ban surveillance advertising and make context advertising the default. And, those remedies act equally on new market entrants and large firms. They work as well for the New York Times as they do for an ex-New York Times reporter who crowdfunds their wage to go to the water board meeting and the school board meeting in a small town every week. They are news bills, not news company bills. And they redound more to the benefit of news workers than a link tax would.
Well, I'm not going to start getting a fight with you on the newspaper bill on this show, but we should do that on another show sometime for sure. I was excited. Darren said that Goliath always wins, and we named our magazine The Sling and this show The Slingshot. So I think at least we're optimistic that we might be changing things, but who knows? Maybe we're just crazy and kind of beating our heads into the side of the wall. But I feel like we might make a difference. Who knows? But Cory, I just want to say I think we've reached the top of the hour, and it was so fun to have you on. I felt like the energy level on the show is just fantastic, and I can't wait for our listeners to enjoy it as much as I did. So thank you again for being on. Thanks, Darren. Thanks, Marshall, for being here. And both you guys, all three of you guys, have a wonderful night.
Good night, guys. Thank you.
I'll see you. Bye-bye.
Bye.